I'm Katrin Detmar. I'm a graduate student at German Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the panel Living Memory, Constructing the Past. The title was decided upon by the panelists who tried to convey the complexity of the nature of memory and what it does. And I think all of the 4 presentations you will hear today will speak to that. So we start in a slightly different order from what you have in the program. So the first presenter is Charles Pletcher. Charles is a classic and complete concentrator from New Providence in Pennsylvania. He didn't realize that people still studied ancient Greek until he got to college, that's Lancaster County. But once he read Plato's Gorgias, he was hooked. In his free time, Charles enjoys reading, running, baking bread, and writing cheeky autobiographies.
Hi, I'm Charles. So my presentation is just going to be a quick sort of overview of the work I've been doing on sorry. On Plato and Homer this year. I focused specifically on the Nequia in the Odyssey and on the Phaedrus and Republic of Plato. So I'll start with a quote from Borges. Borges writes in La Narrativa de la Personalidad, there is no whole self. Mistaken is he who defines personal identity as the private possession of some treasury of memories. Whoever asserts as much abuses the symbol that embodies memory in the form of a lasting intangible granary or depot, when it is nothing but the name through which we indicate that within the innumerability of all the states of conscience, many occur anew in a blurred form. The self as a construct meets little contemporary resistance. The abuse of the granary or depot model of memory appears as a familiar trope to those who understand the self as always reconstituting itself in its ever-changing contexts. We repeat stories with subtle shifts in emphasis, and we persuade ourselves with these stories. Their innumerability makes them convincing, if only because it forces us to acknowledge that we cannot count them all. The thrust of Borges' assertion becomes apparent a little further on. What I do deny is that the rest of the conviction should be adjusted to the well-known antithesis between the self and the non-self, and that this should be constant. Situating the self in the tired dichotomy between I and not I only gives the impression of a constant that is consistent self. This image of the self fails to take stock of the fact that other selves are constituted based on their relationship to one's own self. Put another way, one is oneself only in relation to other people, only to the extent that the other people, in addition to oneself, remember the self. There was a lot of selves, I realized, sorry. The Odyssey, then, is the story of this relationship to others and of the self that results from that relationship, at least by my reading. So the Odyssey is the story of this man, Odysseus, who's basically just trying to get home. He just finished up fighting in the war at Troy for 10 years and ends up spending another 10 years on the Mediterranean, just trying to make it back to Ithaca, which is, there have been debates about where that actually is, but it's somewhere near modern-day Greece. The Odyssey is then that story, and Odysseus recounts his journey for the Phaeacians, who are these island people that he runs across, making subtle shifts in emphasis and delivery from Homer's narration of the same events in previous books of the Odyssey. This is Odysseus and Circe. Sorry, well, this is unfortunate. This is Odysseus and Calypso, rather. The story sort of starts out with him trapped on her island. She's trying to make him forget Ithaca, to forget Penelope and all those types of things. And Odysseus, by a certain reading, is a hero because he's the hero of memory, because he's able to remember things that other people would have forgotten. He's able to remember in spite of Calypso's attempts to make him forget. One such example of this, of his excellent memory, is the shifts that occur when he's describing the death of the weakest of his companions, Elpenor. So the first time that we get this story, and this text is all messed up, I'm really sorry. The Odysseus tells us there was a certain Elpenor, the youngest of the lot, neither at all very strong in battle nor fit in his mind, who apart from the others and me in the holy house of Circe, desiring cool air, had lain down, being heavy with wine. He was drunk. But when he heard the din and thunder of his comrades, he awoke suddenly and forgot in his head to go back down again by the long ladder. But straight down from the roof he fell, and his neck was broken from the vertebrae, and his soul went down to Hades. Odysseus tells the same story again in the following book, this time in the mouth of Elpenor. Elpenor addresses Odysseus, God-born son of Laertes, Odysseus of many resources, evil destiny of the spirit, and copious wine misled me. And laying down on the hall of Circe, I didn't think as I went to go back down again on the long ladder, but straight down from the roof I fell, and my neck was broken from the vertebrae, and my soul went down to Hades. Odysseus occupies a position as a storyteller that Homer can only approach. Homer, who or whatever that name may signify, always narrates an account that is, at best, second-hand. Odysseus, at least from the perspective internal to the Odyssey, tells his own story. Odysseus narrates both depictions of Elpenor's death, though he suggests in the first that he wasn't aware of Elpenor's death when he actually died, although he noticed he was missing when the rest of Odysseus' crew journeyed to Hades. And the fall and death of Elpenor then stand as Odysseus' construction of an individual in opposition to himself. In contrast to Odysseus' superlative memory, Elpenor forgets, or eklathato, that he has fallen asleep on Circe's roof and promptly steps off and dies. Memory allows Odysseus to follow Circe's long directions to Hades. In other words, memory grants Odysseus passage to Hades while he's still alive, while forgetfulness brings about Elpenor's death and some journey to the underworld. In the Phaeacians and the symbolism of Odysseus' return, Charles Segal writes, "The tale to the Phaeacians is told by the man who has lived it, with its uniqueness and personal vividness in his own mind. He has not only lived it in the past, but relived it inwardly and absorbed and grasped it synoptically for the future. What Odysseus tells, then, is remembered experience, inwardly formed and transmuted." Odysseus uses the foil of Elpenor not only to tell the Phaeacians the story of his youngest companion, but also to provide a backdrop for his construction of himself. Odysseus recognizes that his return to Ithaca and his wife Penelope depends on the Phaeacians' knowledge of him, and he marks off the story of Elpenor as an articulation not only of his leadership abilities, he cares even for the least of his crew, but also of himself in negative relief compared to the wretched figure of Elpenor. Odysseus sets Elpenor down. This is Kirke doing her work. She's described as Polypharmaca, which means the goddess of many drugs. And it's actually a pharmacon that she ends up trying to charm Odysseus with. Odysseus sets Elpenor down as a memorial in speech to match the memorial of Elpenor's burial site. Wandering Odysseus does not fail to notice even the lowliest of his companions. Plato's Phaedrus begins with a discussion of rhetoric and ends with a discussion of writing. Plato hopes to practice a speech by Lysias on Socrates, but Phaedrus hopes to practice that speech, but he does not know the speech by heart, so he must read. The word is anagignosko, which also means to know well or recognize the speech to Socrates. Reading always takes the shape of recognition. It always returns to the text. As Jacques Derrida puts it at the outset of Plato's Pharmacy, a text is not a text unless it hides from the first comer, from the first glance, the law of its composition and the rules of its game. A text becomes a text by virtue of its demand that the reader come back to it in order to understand it better. The risk with this return, as the Phaedrus makes clear, lies in thinking that the text might say something new upon one's coming back to it. One cannot take writing or any composed speech seriously without being deceived by the speech. A written text at best serves as a reminder. This is Socrates' argument against the writtenness of the text. The best of these texts have been written only as reminders. Somebody is a fool if he thinks that there's actually vividness that rests in the text itself and not instead in the ideas that it presents and allows one to talk about. So in a sense, a text has to be something that we're always calling to mind, that we're remembering, and that we're constructing in opposition to ourselves in a way similar to how Odysseus constructs the figure of Elpenor in order to craft a clearer picture of himself. In the Republic, Socrates and Glaucon conclude with an attempt to render completely what is due to the just and unjust man. Socrates proceeds to tell the myth of a man, according to the myth, whom the gods permitted to witness the events of the afterlife so that he might return to tell the story of them as a messenger. Does not witness the punishments and rewards of the unjust and just souls. He simply hears them discussing their experiences. The debt owed to each kind of soul, as in the Phaedrus, is the debt to its memory. The souls cannot themselves remember their experiences after drinking the water from the river Lethe, because he who drinks forgets everything. however, is prevented from drinking the water. His duty is to remember and report the experiences of the souls. His task parallels the task given to Odysseus by his mother in Hades. Anticlea, Odysseus' mother, says, "But quickly return to the light with all haste. And all these things that you've seen here you must know, so that also you might tell them to your wife afterwards." To tell the things afterward, to know them again, is to recognize them, anagignosko again. Knowledge remembers and recreates not only one's companions, as in Odysseus' story of Elpenor, but also oneself. It is the recognition of things that we have seen before. It's the fulfillment of the debt to memory. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time. Rehashing the fact that Elpenor dies and goes to Hades because he forgot where he was. He was drunk and forgot where he had fallen asleep. Odysseus, on the other hand, gets to go to Hades while alive because he remembers everything so well. In the Phaedrus, Plato gestures towards this inevitability of death with the idea of pharmakon. As we mentioned, Circe is the goddess polypharmaca, and here again, Plato picks up this word as something that can be used as a reminder, but that's not actually the thing itself. Derrida glosses this as the dead and rigid knowledge shut up in Biblia, the absence of vividness in spite and because of the appearance of life. Writing looks always on the verge to speak, but it remains silent. Only when we put the reminders to use, when we bring them into play, can the writing of the story have any purchase on reality. By using the reminders of his stories, Odysseus crafts a representation of himself that convinces the Phaeacians to take him to Ithaca. By remembering the shades he encounters in Hades, by memorializing them in his story, Odysseus achieves not simply his own homecoming, but also his own preservation. Memory keeps Odysseus alive. Odysseus can win his own soul because of his commitment to homecoming for his companions, as set out in the 5th line of the entire epic. His stories, then, of them, though they have all died by the time he reaches Calypso's island, only emphasize that commitment. He brings them home in memory. Further, his memorializing of the shades in Hades underscores his own self-sacrifice. He consents to go to the underworld, that is, he consents to die, in order to learn and preserve the truth. Derrida reads a similar sacrifice on the part of Socrates. The nakedness of the pharmakon, the blunt, bare voice, carries with it a certain mastery in the dialogue, on the condition that Socrates overtly renounce its benefits. Knowledge is power, passion, pleasure. On the condition, in a word, that he consent to die. The death of the body, at least, that is the price that must be paid for truth and the true knowledge, which are also powers. Odysseus goes down to Hades despite his ability to use the pharmakon that Hermes gave him, the protective against Circe's own pharmakon. Socrates dies because of hemlock, a pharmakon in its own right, but not before he wields his own countercharm, which is alexipharmaca, so you can hear the play on that word, in the pursuit of truth. Odysseus' apologoi, then, we'll just go forward. Sorry. Technical difficulties, but I'll wrap up here. Odysseus' apologoi delivered to the Phaeacians represent an attempt to suspend the narrative motion of time, the interminable march towards death, in order to descend to learn the truth and ascend with the truth in hand. This vain attempt to stall time results in parallel timelines that structurally result in the hallmark of epic, its parallel ring composition. Narratively, these timelines constitute a vertical axis that, like the ups and downs throughout the Republic, turn memory into a recovery of truth. The subtle changes in the tellings and retellings of various stories, such as in the 2 accounts of Elpenor's fall, encircle the truth of the event. Odysseus' descent to Hades, then, operates in the realm at the center of certain of these parallel rings, the center of his stay at Phaeacia, the center of his apologoi, and the center of Elpenor's death. He recounts his journey to the Phaeacians not simply in order to win their favor or to memorialize his family and companions, but to construct his place within that journey. Odysseus must summon memory in order to conjure up himself. In a word, Odysseus wins his soul in his homecoming by fulfilling the debt he incurs in the underworld that imposed on him by his mother Anticlea. He knows well all that he saw, and he tells the story afterward. Thanks. Sorry that my presentation didn't work as well as I'd planned, but hopefully it's easy enough.
Good chance. Frank, you next?
Yep. Should come over there.
It's
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So our next presenter is Frank Rinaldi, who is graduating this spring with a double concentration in Africana Studies and Economics. While at Brown, he has been active in WELS, a prison education program, the Brown Writing Fellows, and student government. Next year, he will be working in the medical technology industry. His thesis paper on African development formed the basis for his presentation today.
Hello, my name is Frank Rinaldi. I'll get to the topic of my presentation shortly, but I would like to start by thanking Peggy, Chang, and the student coordinators in the CRC who have put this conference together and provide us all this wonderful forum to present our work. Professor Detmer for facilitating this panel, and everyone in the audience for taking time out of their days to come and listen to what we have to say. Having now given recognition to those who have made today possible, I'd like to introduce you to my work. The title of my presentation, in fitting with the panel's theme of memory, is Remembering Africa, the role of memory in shaping the possibilities for development. As we are situated within Brown University, and I assume the audience today is primarily American, my definition of development here refers to those efforts by the developed world to promote economic growth, political stability, and social harmony within the African continent. This title reflects the realization that the ways in which we shape the past and construct memories directly impact how we conceive of what is possible. Indeed, memories are the key, not to the past, but to the future. As I seek to argue here that the way in which we develop the world, remember Africa, directly limits the possibilities for our development policy to produce viable results. Without a proper historicization and humanization of African peoples, foreign development policy will continue to produce the sort of failures we've largely become accustomed to. I begin now by first asking, what is memory? Memory is not equivalent to the actual events or facts of a given circumstance, but rather is narratives and metaphors we attach to particular moments that allow us to categorize and explain complex phenomena. A simple example is the famous boom-bust cycle in economics. There's no literal economic roller coaster we're all riding upon that inevitably must ebb and flow. But rather, this image allows us to simply understand the complex actions and decisions of millions and billions of people throughout the world and across space and time. There's no natural peak at which the decline must begin, or vice versa. But in the creation of this metaphor, history, and especially American history, comes to be seen through the lens of booms and busts, with these moments constituting the a priori conditions that frame other historical events. More interesting, perhaps, this metaphor allows us to understand history as always progressing. As graph shows, a bust becomes simply a precondition to greater prosperity in the future. As some of you may begin to expect, this example is not selected arbitrarily, but rather it was chosen for the way in which it encapsulates the developed world's, and especially America's means of remembering itself and shaping the possibilities for its future as always progressing. Do we in the developed world remember Africa's past and frame its future in the same way as we do our own? There are three particular moments I'd like to look at in attempting to answer this question. The Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, the 2012 documentary, and the Millennium Villages Project. For those who are not aware, The Book of Mormon is a comedic play developed by a duo who created South Park about two Mormon missionaries attempting to convert people in Uganda. Many of the last are derived from the absurdity of the Mormon faith, or any faith for that matter, in light of suffering and disease that plagues the country. A running gag is that even the village doctor has AIDS. The joke, while seemingly harmless, is but one example of the ways in which Africans are constantly portrayed as bumbling and incapable throughout the play. They only achieve a measure of self-worth when the white protagonists tweak Mormon stories to fit Ugandan conditions. Thus, their liberation comes through the ability of a white man to craft their history for them, a task which they are not capable of conceiving for themselves. Naturally, it has won numerous Tony Awards and been declared by at least one reviewer as the best musical of the century. To continue talking about Uganda, Cone 2012 is a documentary produced by Invisible Children, an NGO operating in the country, which was just released in March. It documented the abuses of Joseph Kony, a Ugandan warlord, especially as they relate to the abduction and forced military service of children. The portrait of a clear bad guy created a sense of urgency among young idealists in America, as the video was posted and reposted across American social networking profiles on Facebook and Twitter. The picture on the right kind of jokes about that. I don't know if you guys can read it, but it says, "I don't pretend to know everything about African politics, but when I do, it's because I watched a 30-minute video." And it expresses this kind of sentiment that people really took up this cause based on this single documentary. Yet in Uganda, the video was criticized and rejected by many who argued that the video was more about whites than Ugandans. The focus on Kony functioned to raise him to the level of celebrity and reduce the complexity of the event and all the factors that create the conditions for such tragic events as child abduction to occur. This point of contention reveals the stark differences in the ways in which we in the developed world think about Africa and the ways in which Africans think about themselves. These first two examples have revealed that the ways in which we remember Africa and conceive of its history are radically different from the way in which we conceive of our own as ever progressing. By contrast, Africans are seen as suffering and incapable of solving their own problems, meaning white people or other people in the developed world to even articulate what problems they are facing and to find solutions to those problems. Our third example helps to directly connect the consequences of attaching this line of memory to development policy. The Millennium Village Project is the brainchild of Columbia economist Jeffrey Sachs, pictured here to the left. The basic idea behind the project is to target problems in education, healthcare, sanitation, agriculture, and enterprise simultaneously, promoting positive externalities across each sector, and to show what success looks like. This last phrase is what becomes particularly troublesome. The assumption inherent within this statement is that Africans do not know what success looks like, and furthermore, that our notion of success is the only one worth striving for. The historical continuum that we are operating from does not include coordinates such as the Lagos Plan of Action, the Guinea-Bissau Liberated Zones, the African Alternative Structural Adjustment, and the African Civil Society Response to NEPAD. All of these are plans that have been outlined by Africans as responses to their problems, and written within their own notions of what success looks like and what development means to them. These plans are ignored, not because they've been intellectually or practically debunked, but rather because the very way in which we remember Africa prevents us from fully seeing and understanding them properly. The view of Africa as underdeveloped and backward creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, where those terrible aspects are the ones we notice and emphasize. I'd like to present a few images here. See Lagos, Nigeria, Harare, Zimbabwe, Didi, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Johannesburg, South Africa. These skylines reveal there is much more to Africa than the images of poverty that we often focus upon. Oh, one more. And this last image here comes from a recent Nigerian protest in which, in response to government sanctioned violence, the protesters, comprised of both Christians and Muslims, work together, and we see the Christians forming a circle around the Muslims as they conduct their daily prayers. This shows the abilities of Africans to peacefully and creatively respond to their own challenges and develop new solutions to their problems. In not remembering the full history, nor the multitude of current realities within Africa, the possibilities for development become limited to a singular end of replacing what we have created, to replicating rather, what we have created in the developed Western world. The question of what else never arises, and more than this is not even acknowledged as a valid question to be asked. Do not confuse my words though. Nobody denies that there are problems in healthcare, education, politics, economics, and the like that need to be solved. What I suggest though is that the answers that Africans develop for themselves, rooted in their own remembrance of history and notions of future from that history, may be a more appropriate and humane way to approach this issue rather than imposing our own cultural values upon them. What then is the role of the developed world with respect to Africa then? This is a question I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves. I would argue that asking this question is actually premature. Before we can properly answer it, we must reconstruct our memory of Africa in such a way so that different possibilities are opened up, where we can imagine as developing along a path different from our own. Reconstructing this memory requires not just changing the history books, but a fundamental interrogation of why it is that we feel so much responsibility for Africa's underdevelopment. The answer is always right below the surface, but rarely fully acknowledged. I will use a quote from, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Ngugi wa Thiong'o to elaborate upon what I mean. It's the moral consequences that deeply worry me. The negative perception of Africa and Africans by others, and negative self-conception of Africa and Africans by Africans. Those two conceptions have common ground in the devaluation of African lives. Massacres and genocide can happen in Africa, as in the case of Rwanda with the world looking on. But we have seen how frantic the world and Africa become if a white European hostage is missing or meets death in Africa. It shows an indifference towards the descendants of slaves and deep concern for the descendants of slave owners. The world needs to learn from its past. Thiong'o here reveals the failure of both the Western world and Africa to achieve closure on the traumatic history of slavery and later colonialism. The failure of the Western world to fully acknowledge and accept responsibility for its past sins and its continued exploitation of the African continent create both the guilt that leads to the current forms of development policy and a selective memory that prevents a full acknowledgement of the problems Africa has faced since independence cannot be considered purely the fault of Africans themselves. We need to come to terms with our own history with Africa before we can properly understand their current struggles and development needs. Until we allow ourselves this collective reflective moment, billions of dollars will keep being poured down the drain in the vain effort to remake Africa in our own image. I attempted to sketch throughout how the ways in which we remember Africa shape the scope of what we can see to be possible with regards to development. Our current ahistorical understanding of Africa prevents us from recognizing that their history and forms of life are different than our own and has consequently produced different driving values and ways of understanding development. I feel as if I'd given much bad news throughout the course of this talk, so I'd like to end on a hopeful note. The thing about memory is that, as our panel title notes, it is living and always being constructed and reconstructed. Its changing nature leaves it open to new ideas and perspectives. Knowledge production and scholarship around African political economy and development theory from African scholars then can be seen to move beyond the role of knowledge for knowledge's sake. In bringing this overlooked knowledge to the fore, there lies the potential to remake our memory and establish a new Western consciousness towards Africa. It is not beyond our capability in the West to fully recognize and appreciate the humanity of our brothers and sisters in the African continent. In achieving this full recognition, we will find many new and exciting possibilities for the future opened up to both us and to Africa. Thank you very much for your questions.
Okay, sure. Okay, our next two presenters are Nicole Friedman and Gili Kliger. Nicole is an English concentrator from Piedmont, California, and she plans to pursue journalism after graduation. And Gili is a literary arts and computer science double concentrator from Chapaka, New York, with an interest in film, storytelling, and the impact of narrative. In the fall, she will pursue a master's in European literature and culture at the University of Cambridge.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming. We're presenting a capstone project that we conducted in January over winter break called In Conversation, Aging Across the States. And this project kind of grew out of two different questions or interests that we had. So the first was kind of looking at the geographic distribution and influence of geography on female health outcomes. So kind of we planned to drive across the country and really see how the actual geographic locale of state and city influences the lived experience of female health and the females who live in those cities. And then on top of that, this really kind of came out of conversations that we've had about our grandmothers, and in Gili's case, her great-grandmother, and the influence that they've had on our lives. And both of us kind of are very close to our respective grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and feel that those conversations between our generation and older generations are kind of crucial in what they can teach us, and also kind of potentially lost in a matter of time.
So upon our return, in reflecting upon it, we were kind of struck by some of the challenges we faced in using those personal or trying to use those personal memories as an entry point into past, into history, and trying to construct that past from just these individual stories. So we're gonna just bring out a few points that we came up with kind of in reflecting, and also show you, hopefully, if it works, show you some clips from some of our interviews.
And these are photos of some of the women we spoke to. So just logistically about our trip, we drove from my house in California back here to Brown in 18 days. It was crazy. This is everywhere we stopped. So as you can see, it was winter. We took a southern route, and we went through the southwest, across the desert, into the Navajo reservation, and then down to Texas and into the southeast, and then up the east coast. And the 5 cities that we stopped in to conduct interviews were Albuquerque, New Mexico, Dallas, Texas, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, and New York City.
And just some numbers. We conducted 24 interviews in 5 states. The youngest woman we interviewed was 61 years old, and the oldest was 98.
So in doing these interviews, they were kind of both oral histories and a focus in particular on aging. And so we tried to get these women's life stories and really to ask them to talk about themselves. And then we also tried to get them to reflect a little bit about the experience of aging, the place they live, and how kind of that experience is perhaps different, perhaps the same in sort of a broader context. And it was kind of funny. In some ways it really backfired, because we were looking for these like big answers. And so every single woman we asked, how has your city changed? How has where you live right now changed since you were young? And we thought, these are women, women's rights have radically changed. Some of them are women of color. They're gonna have, reflective, broader things to say. And the biggest, most common answer we got was traffic. Pretty much everybody said traffic was the #1 way in which their city has changed.
So just, I guess we wanted to highlight sort of an example of that with one of our interviewees. So we're going to show you a clip from Gwendolyn. She wouldn't tell us her age, but she's from Atlanta and she grew up in Jackson. And in this clip, she's talking about her experience reading and watching the DVD for The Help,
Which is set in Jackson around the time that she grew up.
Rachel, and I love that book and the DVD, and I bought the book as soon as it came out when I heard it. You know, the girl wrote it, grew up in Jackson. But I was telling her that part of Jackson that she wrote about, it was wonderful, but wonderful for the way it was portrayed and the way she tried to bring out this relationships between maids and the people who hired them. But I was telling her that we did not experience all of that. You know, it was a little different for us growing up.
So that really kind of speaks to the fact that for many of these women, she didn't have a memory of Jackson being this heavily segregated, oppressive society that kind of no longer feels like that today. She had a very kind of warm, enriching childhood in her community and was not kind of necessarily aware or reflective upon the broader societal narratives that we can see today looking back historically.
Yeah. So another one of our stops that was really cool, when we were in Dallas, we stopped at a old age home and they let us sit in on a memoir writing class. And so it was like 15 men and women who had gathered, and week to week they were working on writing their memoirs. And so it was really interesting to listen to some of the problems they were having and trying to, call from their memories and come up with a life story. And so some of our reflections about their challenges were that really when they were having trouble writing, the instructor told them, just write whatever you can think of. And a lot of times what that meant was that they came up with these like really random anecdotes and little stories from different times, which seems like sort of an accurate reflection of how memory might work.
Yeah, that people don't necessarily see their life as a story, and it's actually very difficult for people to look back and tell a narrative from all of these different events that have happened over maybe 60, maybe 80 years. And one of the women we met in this memoir writing class, Genevieve, is 98 years old, and she was kind of emblematic of this disconnect between narratives that we might be looking for and how individual memories work. That she has a remarkable memory. She knows the address of every home she's ever lived in, all in Dallas. But she really did have difficulty telling a story of her life, and she rambled a lot, and we kept trying to pull together, so where were you living when this happened? And she had all of these very clear stories, but it didn't really connect into something that we might think of as a memoir. But this is one of the stories she told.
One day the preacher of the Oak Lawn Methodist, which is on Wycliffe and Oak Lawn, but they moved somewhere else. It's in a Presbyterian now. But the preacher there called and said, Miss Olsen, is it all right to put Oscar's and Nancy's announcement of their wedding in the paper? I said, what? He said, oh, you didn't know, did you? I said, no. He said, what can I do? I said, there's not a thing you can do if they're all ready to get married and ask you about it.
That was her oldest son. So, in preparing for this project, neither of us actually had any experience doing oral histories, and so we did a little bit of research, and I came across this incredible essay from the 1970s about oral history as a feminist activity, and kind of particularly female oral histories. So if I can just read the quote, it says, "The oral history can serve as a positive function in the aging process by helping to integrate past life experiences, cope with reduced life activity and loss of close relationships, and ultimately prepare for death. Women's oral history is the creation of a new type of material on women. It is the validation of women's experiences. It is the communication among women of different generations. It is the discovery of our own roots and the development of a continuity which has been denied us in traditional historical accounts." And we very much feel that our project fits into this definition of oral history and female oral history as a feminist encounter and an encounter between women of different generations that can create kind of new versions of history or new kind of definitions of what history can mean. And that came out a lot in the fact that as the dynamics of this interview, that we were strangers who were very interested in these women's lives, and so that's both affirming for them, that it makes them feel important and special and worthy of being interviewed, but also because we're strangers, they were in some ways more open with us about certain topics than they were with people they were very close to. And we asked all of these women about death and their thoughts on dying, and we actually got incredibly candid responses.
Yeah, I mean, that was another point that we wanted to make because, the New York Times has this old age blog, and it's becoming a sort of bigger thing where they're really how important it is for older people to talk with their children about how they want to die and how often those conversations aren't happening because, we're not. It's not something that we as a society are, usually comfortable with. But it was interesting that almost nobody that we talked to by the end of the interview felt uncomfortable sharing this with us.
And they all think about death and want to talk about it.
Yeah, and so the last video clip we're going to show is from the first interview we did with Petra Sanchez from Albuquerque. And I think she might have been our favorite just because she was so sweet and sort of jumping off what Nikki was mentioning about oral history, it was interesting because very often she said something like, she would tell us a whole story and then pause and say, well, I hope that was interesting for you, and she definitely doubted that a lot. And I mean, we found her story incredibly interesting, so we're just going to show you a clip about, she's talking about talking to her children about that.
I don't know, I think change is so gradual for me that I don't see anything drastically changing. Even my kids. They're still my kids. I'm trying to take care of myself, trying to see that I don't become a bigger burden on the kids. That's my main concern. And so I think that helps to keep it stronger.
So, we preserved all of these stories on a blog that if you have a smartphone, you can use the QR code. We don't have smartphones, so we don't know if it works. But we created a blog throughout our trip, and that was a really important actually medium for us because it really allowed us a lot of flexibility in how we wanted to tell each of these women's stories, and some of them are video, some are transcripts, some are our personal reflections, and also the fact that it's online gives it kind of first of all, an accessibility that these women could share it with people in their lives, but also a permanence. And we know at least one of the women that we interviewed in January has passed away. We don't know if there are others, but these stories are not going to exist forever, and we have kind of helped create some sort of record of these women that now exists online and now can be shared with their families, with strangers, and preserved in kind of a more continuous way.
Right, and so in addition, so we talked about some of the challenges that came with trying to use these stories as an entry point to the history, but at the same time, it's in many ways you need to get those individual stories, and it's a way, and it's a kind of history that you can't tell with numbers or things like that, and that's why having this blog is really important because it allowed us to have these videos, pictures, written reflections. And that's Nikki's car in my driveway at the end of our trip when the East Coast welcomed us back with a snowstorm.
Yeah, we made it all the way across the country safely, and then we could not get out of Gili's driveway.
Question. Since you were traveling across the country, how were you referred to these women? How did you get the names?
A couple of different ways. So some of them were personal connections through people that we knew who lived in those cities. So like my aunt lives in Albuquerque, and so she helped connect us to people in her community. And others we just called retirement homes, and they were able to connect us with people who lived there.
You called them Cole?
Yeah.
And they did that? Isn't that sort
It
of
was-
infringement of confidentiality?
I mean, they had to
Privacy?
they had to get permission from many of the women we talked to, but in many cases they were so eager to have us. I mean, it was a fun activity for a lot of these women, and especially in Dallas, we didn't know anyone there, so that's really what we relied on. But we actually talked to more women there than any other city because there was one place in particular where the coordinator there just, found like every woman that
wanted to talk, and a lot of retirement communities actually have volunteer coordinators who set up people in the community who are interested in kind of being involved in some way with.
It's a little bit scary, don't you think? I mean, the privacy issue.
Well, we kind of explained to each of these women what our project was and spoke to them about it, and they were all in a capacity that they could consent.
And we always asked, permission for video or photos. I mean, a couple women didn't want to be videoed, so
photographed.
But now you have a blog, so it's gone beyond your personal encounter.
Right, but they knew that.
It bothers me.
We have time for more questions after the last presentation. Our last presenter is Saskia Brechenmacher. Saskia is originally from a small town in southern Germany, but spent most of her childhood in France. Her interest in Eastern Europe was spurred by spending the 2 last years of high school at the United World College in Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina. At Brown, she has concentrated in political science and Slavic studies, and this honest thesis about memory politics in the Ukraine has allowed her to tie these 2 interests together. Next year, she'll be working as a junior research fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., researching specifically processes of democratic transition as well as democratic protest movements in the Middle East and beyond.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to see so many of you. I'm going to be presenting my honors thesis in political science about memory politics in Ukrainian society. I realized after I made the PowerPoint that it is a bit too long, so bear with me if I go over some things quite quickly, and I hope you can raise anything that was unclear in questions afterwards. Before I start off, I just want to maybe start off by saying how I got interested in this topic, because when I tell people, they always are like, well, are you from Ukraine, or what's the deal, how are you interested in this? Well, the first time I went to Ukraine was about in 2010 when I was studying abroad in Moscow, and we did a trip to Ukraine. And what really struck me there was when we walked around Kiev, we came across this memorial, monument for the famine that happened in Ukraine. It's called Holodomor. It happened in the 1930s. And what struck me about the memorial is obviously that it's a very impressive thing. It's big, it's standing in the middle of the landscape, but also it was very clearly going around a political message in a way that I hadn't seen before with memorials. There were all these quotes around it by various political scientists or historians defining what genocide was, and specifically relating the concept of genocide to the Ukrainian famine on the memorial. And that struck me as interesting in a way of how we tend to think about memorials as a way of honoring victims rather than making a specific political point. So going back from that, I started thinking more about it, and actually what, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, how Ukrainian society and how Ukrainian politics have tried to come to terms with what happened in the Soviet period, and specifically in the 1930s, or the period of Stalin's rule and the Second World War. And going off of my readings, that are my initial readings of the topic, I came to my research question, which I examined in the thesis, which was really about why these questions about the past, and specifically about divisive periods in 20th century Ukrainian history, have become increasingly salient in Ukrainian politics since independence. So I think one would expect perhaps that after sort of the end of Soviet rule and the end of Soviet ideology, and for the first time this opening of debate, people would start examining these issues and talking about them openly, that conflicts would emerge. But why have they become increasingly more divisive? And why in the past decade, so 2 decades since independence, political elites are still fighting about these issues and make them, or put them to the forefront of Ukrainian politics. And then, so coming off of that is sort of why do the uses of memory in politics vary from from one decade to another, from one regime or government to another? And I mean, ultimately, it's a larger question about the role of memory in politics and the role of history in politics in periods of transition. So, a quick overview of my approach. I don't want to dwell too long on theoretical approaches because I don't have too much time, and it's also not that interesting. But maybe, as you've already heard from the other speakers here, memory studies is an incredibly diverse field, and it's interdisciplinary. All sorts of disciplines have contributed to it. So a lot of what I was trying to do is figure out what can these different disciplines contribute to the study of politics and memory in politics, because there isn't really a clearly defined field in political science or clearly defined theory about that. So I was looking at nation-building theory and sort of myths and in the creation of nation-states and nationalist movements, as well as transitional justice policies as you move from authoritarian regimes to democracies, and then a more recent sort of field that has emerged about specifically the post-Soviet sphere and why memory has become so divisive, not just in Ukraine, but in the Baltic states, in Poland, etc. And then quickly about collective memory also, I think actually Frank sort of spoke to that a little bit, but when I speak about collective memory, what I speak about mainly is the discourse that is a discourse in society about the events of the past. It's not necessarily what people remember. It's not necessarily the sum of everyone's remembrances. It's often very different from actually group memory or individual memory. But ultimately it is the conception of the past, the narrative of the past of those that hold the most social, cultural, political power. And in my thesis, I looked at specifically 2 case studies. One is the famine that happened in 1932, 1933, specifically as a result of Soviet collectivization policies. So it's very much a man-made famine. And the question has become more about whether this famine specifically targeted Ukraine and was a genocide of Ukrainian people, or whether it was no worries. Or whether it was just a general tragedy that affected all Soviet people. And the second sort of element I looked at were different narratives of the Second World War, and specifically Ukrainian nationalists, which were groups operating in Western Ukraine during the war, and were actually fighting against the Soviet Union, and for a time collaborated actually with Nazi Germany against the Soviets. And also sort of narratives of the Holocaust, which has become a very sort of difficult issue in contemporary Ukraine. And here you have a map of Ukraine. The historical background is very difficult, and I don't want to go too much into it, but what is important is to know that Ukraine as it exists today didn't historically exist. So the western regions, which you see on the left, were historically more part of Poland, were part of Austria-Hungary, and even before Poland, Lithuania, and never really part of the Russian Empire. So they only were incorporated into the rest of the Ukraine that you see sort of darker color here in 1939 after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So whereas in eastern Ukraine or in central Ukraine, the Second World War really started with the invasion of Nazi Germany in 1941. In western Ukraine, it actually began earlier because Soviet forces entered these regions in 1939 to incorporate them into the Soviet Ukrainian Republic. So they're 2 very distinct narratives of the war, and they're very 2 distinct ways of even conceptualizing Ukrainian history. One that is very much rooted in the West, one which is sort of also has a Catholic religious tradition and very strong Ukrainian language tradition, and one that is very much has always been very closely intertwined with Russia and then with the Soviet Union, and has historically not really defined itself as a separate nation. Here's a quick map of Ukraine now since 1991, which is sort of now in this unified boundaries. Now quickly, in memory politics in the 1990s in Ukraine were interesting because you actually didn't see a lot of the things happening that you would expect after a transition from an authoritarian regime to democratization, as well as sort of the emergence of a new nation state that didn't exist before. You didn't have transitional justice policies. There were no purges of communist elites like there were in Poland or in the Baltic states. There weren't truth commissions or anything of the kind. And a lot of what I found, the reason for that was that really there wasn't a big break with the past. The people were in power before, were in power after, and that independence really occurred, although there was sort of a national movement for independence and a popular movement, that movement never grew, was never strong enough to create an overthrow, and that independence really occurred because of external factors, because of what was happening in Moscow. And at some point, Ukrainian elites, political elites, had a sense that independence was in their interest. But this did not mean that they rejected sort of the tradition from which they came or the political practices of the Soviet regime. And this marked Ukrainian politics throughout the 1990s. And if you think about the fact that these people were the same people that were in power before, it makes sense to what extent why they were reluctant to sort of start this critical examination of the communist past, which they themselves were implicated in. The second element is that the new state was very fragile. It was historically divided. It was divided according to linguistic boundaries. it was questioned by Russia, it was questioned by the international community why Ukraine needed to be an independent state. So it was not a given, and if you have a state that's fragile and it's unclear whether it will actually continue existing, it's unlikely that politicians will bring up very divisive issues, historically divisive issues, that could further split the population. So what you see throughout the 1990s is that controversial issues such as was the famine a genocide, or what was the role of these Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War, were largely avoided, were just absent from the national debate, although they were already existed in sort of scholarship in the diaspora. And instead you have two presidents, President Kravchuk and Kuchma, who primarily used history for instrumentalist purposes. So already during the 1990s in elections, they would sort of use that. Both of them came out of the Communist Party, both of them were ideologically, I would say, rather similar, had different electoral bases in different regions of the country, but used history really to sort of either legitimize their own politics, legitimize themselves as post-communist politicians rather than communist politicians, or delegitimize the other, saying that he's a nationalist, he's basically in the tradition of Nazi collaborator, I'm representing sort of Ukrainian interests. So you already have a pattern of history being instrumentalized rather than history being openly debated. And this pattern continued throughout the 1990s, and then you have, many of you have probably heard about the 2004 Orange Revolution, which was sort of heralded as this break in Ukrainian politics, where finally they would break with the Soviet traditions and Soviet narratives and practices that continued to exist. And actually throughout the 1990s, politics in Ukraine became, again, increasingly authoritarian. And with that, it's interesting, you see increasingly also sort of a strengthening of Soviet narratives of the war, sort of the celebration of the Soviet victory myth without any critical questioning of sort of Stalin's role in that. It was like very much a perpetuation of Soviet history. And here I just wanted to show that's the 2004 elections, electoral results, how radically polarized the country was. You have the East and the South almost a unified manner voting for one candidate, which was a sort of a pro-Russian candidate, and the rest of the country voting for the other one. So you see how regional, linguistic, and historical divides directly translate into political choice or political affiliation. Nevertheless, because there was this sort of popular upheaval against authoritarian practices, you had this man come to power, Yushchenko, with the Orange Coalition, who represented change, who represented reform. He said, I want Ukraine to be a European nation. I want Ukraine to be democratic, react against this persisting Soviet narratives about what happened that don't correspond to the truth, historical truth. But then interestingly, what you see in his 6 years in power, you don't actually see any sort of radical change happening in the way politicians treat history, in the way politicians treat collective memory. Instead, you have sort of an interesting reversal where suddenly a new narrative is created and a new narrative is imposed by very much the same means as the old Soviet narrative was imposed, which means top-down meaning creation through laws, through history education, through these very sort of public ceremonies of commemoration that now create a very different story of what had happened, that create a story of Ukrainian victimhood that tries to completely externalize communism and completely externalize the Soviet past as something that was foreign, imposed from Russia, imposed from Moscow, and that had nothing to do with the Ukrainian tradition, which was one that was always Western, always sort of democratic, always longing for freedom. And you have a certain new binary created where Ukrainians are the victims, and organizations like the OUN-UPA, which are the Ukrainian nationalists that operated during the war, are glorified as national heroes. Now, what is sort of problematic about this new narrative is not only the way in which it is imposed, but also sort of the elements it silences. For example, the Ukrainian nationalists, not only did they collaborate with Nazi Germany in the Holocaust in Western Ukraine, in the almost complete annihilation of Ukrainian Jews, but also in massacres against Polish citizens, because they very much embraced this idea of an ethnically Ukrainian nation that was completely a Ukraine for Ukrainians. So there are entire episodes that are silenced because they don't fit this notion of Ukraine as a victim, as a post-colonial nation. Now, why did this happen, or why do we have this increasing salience of these questions? I feel like on the one hand, what I found is that it is, to some extent, we can trace it back to ideology, and that the Orange Coalition that came to power was rooted in Western Ukraine and was rooted in a sort of more nationalist political camp. But on the other hand, there were also very real pragmatic reasons why this became increasingly sort of the thing they focused on, which is that the whole his whole presidency was just marked by political stalemate. Constant infighting, coalitions breaking down, no reforms were implemented, and this was the coalition that had come to power as the reformers, as the democratic reformers, and they were unable to translate these promises of reform into actual political change because of just like internal disagreements. And so I think what I found is that, especially Yushchenko as the president, as a symbolic figurehead of this government, increasingly focused on the symbolic politics as a way of avoiding or sort of representing his government in a positive light when really there wasn't much change happening and there wasn't much political reform happening. The symbolic politics became an easy way out in which he could appeal to his core electorate, which is in the west of the country, and sort of constantly celebrate sort of himself as a figurehead that was acting in the nation's interest. I'll skip over this for the interest of time. Did it work? It's not exactly. He was voted out of office in 2010, was hugely unpopular, mainly because of economic dissatisfaction with the economic crisis really hit Ukraine very hard. And he lost maybe got 5% of the total vote, which is drastic. So you can say to some extent his strategies didn't work. And now we have a new government that again very much perpetuates sort of the patterns we've seen established in the 1990s. And that also shows that in reality, although we had this sort of sudden imposition of a new nationalist narrative, not that much has changed in the way Ukrainian politicians treat the past. He has created a new narrative, which means basically on an official level it says, let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about these divisive issues. They're nationalist, they're polarizing, they're politicized. We want sort of historians to do their work, politicians have nothing to do with this. Now this might sound good on one level, but in reality what this translates into is on a local level, you still have politicians trying to appeal to an electorate, trying to win elections, and sort of a reawakening of Soviet narratives and stereotypes, particularly as this government is trying to appeal to voters in the East and South, which still very much identify with Soviet history and the Soviet history and the Soviet identity. So reawakening narratives of Western Ukraine as Nazis, as nationalists, as people not acting in the nation's interest, and at the same time reinforcing a narrative of sort of unity between Russia and Ukraine and silencing the more problematic aspects of Soviet history. Which in turn, again, leads to radicalization because the opposition sees this happening and then represents it as this Russian invasion, this Russian threat to Ukrainian society. In conclusion, I found that on the one hand you see substantial continuity in the political instrumentalization of history since the fall of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, that politicians continuously in electoral debates, in electoral competitions will appeal to these divisive historical lines in order to either delegitimize their opponents or strengthen their own profile. On the other hand, although there's this continuity, we have seen a radicalization because of, on the one hand, sort of the context that has shifted and that Ukraine now is a more established nation, it's no longer under threat of falling apart. So politicians have less of an interest in appealing to unifying themes and can more easily appeal to this very divisive rhetoric. And what we've seen is now history really has become a battleground or rhetorical battleground for two competing visions of Ukrainian national identity, but that don't necessarily correspond to two competing ideologies or two competing political visions, but rather are played up, that differences between political camps that maybe aren't that different are played up in electoral competitions. And finally, sort of the implications of that large implications, I think, for Ukrainian society and politics, is that on the one hand, we see still 2 decades after Ukrainian independence, no real critical engagement with the Soviet past on an official level. And what I mean by critical engagement is sort of questions exactly of not either saying, let's not talk about the past, or saying Ukraine was a victim always of Russia, of foreign enemies, but saying, well, what exactly happened? What was the role of Ukraine in the Holocaust, for example? What was the role of Ukrainians in bringing to power a Soviet regime? And I mean, there were very powerful Ukrainian officials always in the Soviet Union. So thinking more critically about what has happened in the 20th century and what that means for going forward. But perhaps more worrisome, I think, is the silencing of historical narratives, again, as we saw before in the Soviet Union, is that it's not that things are censored or things are ignored, but definitely, for example, in Ukraine, the story of the Holocaust is marginalized from the political debate as something that is not really part of Ukrainian history, it's part of Jewish history, and that's something we just sort of witness as Ukrainians would study perhaps, I don't know, French history. It's not something that is perceived as being inherently part of what has happened in Ukraine in the 20th century. And I think in the long term, not only does this distract this constant political fighting about the past, about narratives, about rhetoric, from the actual really very real socioeconomic problems in Ukrainian society, but also obstructs in the long term a democratization of public discourse. Because even now we see that certain, for example, universities, etc., are dominated by people who have a certain conception of the Ukrainian past, of the Holodomor, of what happened, and that people who challenge these narratives are completely, immediately identified as enemies of the Ukrainian state, enemies of what's in our national interest, and thereby very much obstructing scholarship, obstructing public debate. And I would like to end on this, and thank you all for listening, and hope to answer your question afterwards.
Thanks. We've heard 4 very interesting talks from very different fields, but I think in the discussion we can sort of see that there's a lot of overlap, but also a lot of troubling of concepts. So I will start off with one general question for all of the panelists, and then we open up the floor to your questions as well. So I was wondering, as I was listening to your talks, we're all very much concerned with how memory in a way is constructed retrospectively. And I was wondering whether it would also come across in your thoughts about the concept of involuntary memory. Memory that cannot be controlled, that is sort of piercing that construction. In contrast to an attempt to forget, but also in contrast to the construction of memory, historical accounts, or memory as discourse. So whoever wants to start.
Well, I guess we'll just go down. I guess involuntary memory, I wouldn't think of it as memory per se, because I see it more as a product of the circumstance and as a response and as the ground on which memory is actually used as a tool. That's kind of been a thread that's gone through a number of these presentations. So, memory seems to, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but memory seems to require some sort of deliberateness.
Okay.
Is I think what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree. This idea of involuntary memory, I don't know if you can really call that memory then, because memory to me is something that's always being constructed and always changing. It's not a constant thing. It's not an impulsive thing, but something that's like a somewhat of a conscious process in creating.
But I think on an individual level, trauma can be seen as involuntary memory, in that there are kind of, for example, in our interviews, these women, it's an intimate encounter, but it is still a performance, and that these women don't know us, and so they're very much putting on a self and presenting themselves and speaking in ways that maybe they thought we would be most receptive to them. But then sometimes we got women kind of talking about a family member who had died at a very difficult point in their life, and they would start to cry, and that kind of broke down. And it wasn't involuntary in the sense that they had not decided to tell us that, but I think there was kind of an emotional impetus behind the memory that was stronger than they had necessarily intended.
I think also we have to be careful sometimes with the word construction, because in a way, the way I found that on a group level, maybe even on an individual level, memories work is, even though we are maybe aware that they're constructed, they're still very real, and people have very real beliefs about what has happened. And for example, something that I noticed in my research, where there's, for example, a lot of effort on a national level to construct memory, perhaps in the sense that we were talking about, through, I don't know, constructing a monument, then on a local level you have massive opposition against that, not necessarily because a new narrative is constructed, but a narrative already exists that is in direct conflict with what is being constructed in a way. So I don't know if that is what exactly you would call involuntary, but I think that the fact that things that have been constructed in the past develop a real force for people and a real meaning for people.
I think just to clarify, it seems that what we have been discussing is sort of shared memory, which seems to have to, even if there is
a sort of involuntary emotional impetus for a memory sharing. There's still a conscious decision to share it, but like trauma or something like that is this private, can be this private memory that it maybe is not shared as explicitly as a lot of the memory that's been under discussion here. But it could nevertheless be shared when someone is just talking. Mm-hmm. These things just come out. They don't necessarily manifest in a narrative or a story, though.
Perhaps just to add to that quickly, it is interesting though that we often use these terms like trauma even to speak about collectives, sort of like a country has experienced, a society has experienced a trauma, and then it's interesting to think about what that means, you know, if it makes sense at a collective level, even though, you know, it's quite a different situation.
Questions from the audience?
I had the feeling when you were talking, the last speaker, you were sort of talking in a way about brainwashing. Resetting the history, you're reconfiguring the history. Did you find that did you speak to any of these people, or was it more of a?
I think the word brainwashing is too strong, and I think this is something I struggle with myself. Is on the one hand, I focus very much on the actions of various political actors and their actions, but I think it's important to realize they're not acting in a void, and they're not making up things that didn't happen. They're responding to, as I said before, they're responding to narratives that exist in society, because they wouldn't appeal to them if they didn't have meaning for people.
Right, there has to be some grounding.
There has to be grounding. Now, where does that grounding come from? It comes, on the one hand, it comes from a long tradition, right, of people telling certain stories, of institutions telling certain stories,
right.
And that, you know, coming together and forming a sort of powerful thing that unites a community or creates an identity. So I wouldn't call it brainwashing. I would call it like. Also, none of them necessarily make up things. You know, it's more the story of what do you talk about, what do you highlight, and what do you not highlight, what do you not talk about. So I think I would think about it more as like a selective interpretation of the past rather than, you know, an invention of the past.
It's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have a question for Gili and Nicole. Just because your presentation made me think about the ways that I haven't spoken to my grandmothers about their lives, I was wondering what did you take away from those conversations, or is there anything you want to share with us about about the process of aging that? Because as a 22-year-old, I'm curious.
So one of our last interviews was with my great grandma in Brooklyn, which was really strange after having, done all these interviews with grandmas that they weren't all grandmas, but with elderly women, and being able to distance myself from from them and being able to ask them questions like, have you spoken to your children or grandchildren about death? And then coming into the last one with my great grandma, and I definitely haven't had any sort of conversations with her about that. But I don't, it did definitely change the way I was, and sort of thinking about my relationship with her, there was a definite period when I realized I was old enough to know that she was going to die soon, and maybe I should call her more, and so. But it was when we actually sat down to talk to her, it was Nikki who asked those kinds of questions, even though I was there. But I think it made both me and my great grandma more aware of the fact that we maybe haven't been having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of kind of the young generation, old generation relationship, I think something that stood out to me so much with these women was the vast difference in loneliness that came from the people who had communities and families that came and visited and supported and were present, and the women that either had no family members to do that or were far away or in some way estranged. And some of these women had formed other sorts of communities, and some of these women were genuinely just really alone, and were so kind of the conversations with those women were so different because these aren't stories they tell or even memories they reflect on because they don't have conversations about their lives with other people. And so, I don't know, my grandma was incredibly insulted that we did not interview her for this project. She talks to me about it all the time. And I do talk to her about her life all the time, but I think there was some sort of level of formality that this would have given it that she felt miffed by not being included. But there is, I think, a huge priority that that should be placed on these conversations and these relationships. And so many of the old women just talked about, like, your body gets old, but you still feel young and you still want to be engaged and be connected to people, and that often that's not reciprocated.
Yeah, so Saskia's presentation, I think your presentation was really interesting in the way that I could really connect it to another panel that I attended yesterday on the intimacy of repression. And a very interesting topic that they brought up in the panel was the idea of infra-politics and how, like, politics at the very macro level, state policies actually penetrate into, like, people's very mundane actions, and, like, you know, like, hop onto your point about involuntary memory and how actions that people do, like, in daily lives that they're not necessarily that aware of actually resulted from, you know, the very state's construction in your case or some more macro level. So my question for you would be, do you only look at this more like macro state level of political memory construction, or do you also dig into, like, the bottom up level and, like, how that plays out in the ground?
It's a really interesting question. I think I was very interested in what was happening, you know, on a more deeper societal level. But on the one hand, that's, with the limited scope I had for this project, that's a whole nother, you know, that's a whole nother area to dive in. And sources are a lot more difficult. Like, what sort of sources do you turn to? So I think I tried to do it a little bit. I mean, I just speaking about my sources in terms of what was happening on a societal level. I mean, I read a lot of newspaper articles and looked at public opinion data and some interviews, but I think my focus wasn't on that because I think it would have opened up a whole new area of going into, particularly if you have these various regional divides, and then you have to go into each, you know, of these regions and also see to what extent these actual binaries actually true. And I think when I speak about further research that's needed, I think a lot of what is needed is sort of more research on what is the effect of this on people's narratives. And actually, interestingly, there's a very good research institute in Kiev that does a lot of work on public opinion, but also just general Ukrainian politics. And they did an interesting study, and what they found a lot of times is that in in-depth interviews, people were very aware of what was going on. They were aware of how conflicts were played up, or how divides between regions were specifically increased, like this sort of divide and rule politics that's happening. People were not, like, completely, you know, oblivious to what was going on. And I think if you look at generally what's happening in Ukraine is just across the board disillusionment with politics and politicians and lack of trust in the political class. And I think that in itself is a very interesting phenomenon, which is not unique to Ukraine at all, but in lots of post-Soviet societies. But so I hope that answers to some extent. But yes, in this project I focus more on the macro level, I think, because that was more manageable. But I think it's definitely incredibly interesting to see how that filters down.
I think we're running out of time, so please join me in thanking the panelists and wishing them all the best for their future careers. And please remember that we're also up for the Synergy Award, so text for your favorite panel that you have visited today. We have the keywords for every panel at the back of the slip. Our keyword is memory. Thank you all for coming, and have a nice Saturday.
Thank you all. We also have a poster session starting at 4 p.m. In Lund Gallery, and we have 20 fabulous poster presenters, following which we will have a closing reception. All of you, especially our presenters, are invited to come there, and that's where we will be announcing the winner of the Synergy Award. So thank you all for coming.